Another day, another recap. Today we'll be diving into a crime action thriller movie titled Empire State. Without further ado, spoilers ahead, so watch out and as always enjoy the recap. The movie opens up with the biggest cash robbery in United States history. A staggering $8 million was stolen, and both the FBI as well as detectives are perplexed how the robbers cut a hole in the roof and that the cameras inside had been moved, making it look like an inside job. At a police station, Detective James Ransom asks a woman where the money is. We go back to 3 months earlier in Queens where Eddie quits his current job. One of his bosses gets physical with him until Eddie's friend pulls up and knocks the man out. The duo then get into the car and take off. Here we are introduced to Chris, an old friend of Eddie's. Once they park up, the duo grabs a statue from the back of the car and Chris takes it to his mother as a gift. She thanks her son and Eddie, and they take off once again. This time Chris makes his way to a hangout where he asks Spiro where his father is. Heading into the bathroom we meet Chris's dad, Tommy. Spiro quickly joins them then runs amok on the both of them. Chris isn't too happy with it though, and a bit of pushing and shoving takes place till someone walks in and stops the fight. The next day, Chris reads over the NYPD patrol guide while having breakfast with his dad. Just then, he is handed a mail where his request was denied for employment with the NYPD as he did not clear security protocols due to a prior criminal offense. Chris immediately links up with Eddie and 2 others. Knowing that Chris is attempting to be an officer, the 2 walk away. Chris then tells Eddie that the doobie he gave him years ago means he cannot be a cop anymore. Later, Chris goes to a diner and sees a friend named Nancy. She tells him if he needs anything to let her know. Just then, Chris sees an ad in the paper for a security guard position. He heads directly to the spot and speaks to the boss. They are willing to give Chris $200 a week and without blinking twice he agrees to the job. The following morning, Chris is working with Tony inside an armored truck. Tony explains that they do about 8 to 10 pickups a day and by Wednesday morning they go back to the reserve. The duo then go to their first pickup of the day where Tony likes to keep things simple. He tells Chris to watch the truck as he gets the items. He returns with the cash and once they load the money, Chris sits in the back as Tony takes off. As they continue through the day, Tony wants to get home early for his daughter's birthday. Back at their facility, Tony grabs the keys to their lockup and everything seems very unprofessional. However, Chris's expression quickly changes when he sees $25 million worth of cash. A dog actually lives in the lockup as a guard, but other than that and a camera, there isn't much more to it. Tony wants to leave the last couple of drop-offs for Chris to do it alone as he wants to get to his daughter's birthday. Tony takes off and Chris finishes up and gets home to see his dad sitting on the table. Chris's mother comes out and explains that after 10 years, Tommy was fired for no reason. Seems the bathroom incident from earlier was the cause, and Chris is not happy one bit. On the job the next day, Chris complains to Tony about his father's circumstance and knows they're involved in some criminal business. While distracted though, a van stops and a bag is thrown under the truck. Then suddenly, boom. A gunman immediately shoots Tony then Chris, but Tony still manages to put up a fight until the entire clip is unloaded inside him. The 2 robbers hear sirens and immediately take off. At the scene later on, Detective James walks up to Chris and asks him that if he was involved in anything he should say it now. Chris swears at James and says he liked Tony before walking away. That night, Nancy joins Chris and his family to make sure that he's okay. She then takes off and as Chris's sister joins the table, Eddie comes into the house. He quickly makes himself at home and Chris walks away from him. After a couple weeks, Chris gets back on the job with a new worker. He goes about his business and sees the bullet holes in his old work clothes when he gets called in by the boss who wants him to do night shift instead. Chris isn't too happy, but he bites the bullet and leaves. At night, working as the lockout guard, the other 2 workers aren't bothered taking the money from the truck into the lockout room, and want Chris to watch the cameras the entire night instead. And as you'd expect, Chris gets bored quite easily and runs around the place to check everything out. The next day, Chris tells Eddie that the owners and workers are forging papers and are all stealing. As the duo walk past Spiro and his man, Eddie swears at them for firing Tommy for no reason. Nothing happens, and when the duo get into the car, Eddie tries convincing Chris to steal some money. That night, work is on as usual and Chris has a few things in mind. He unlocks the gate to the lockup, then puts in the pin to open the door just a little. A phone rings and the boss asks what's going on and he says a light was flickering, but everything is good now. Trying to avoid the camera, Chris uses a metal rod to grab the nearest bag of cash and rip it out. He immediately shows Eddie what he managed to do and mentions how the camera doesn't even see the door and that the place is a joke. With the $25,000 he stole, he puts half in an envelope and knocks on a house. A mother and daughter appear and it seems to be Tony's wife and daughter. Chris hands them the envelope and apologizes for what happened. That night, Eddie blabbers to the men from earlier exactly how Chris came about the 25 grand. Both Jimmy the Greek and Mike Dimitriou ask Chris if he's the only worker at night. Chris immediately kills the conversation and later puts it on Eddie for opening his mouth as both those goons work for Spiro. Eddie doesn't stay silent though and tells Chris that if they manage to steal $1 million, they will never have to work a day in their lives again. Once at home, Tommy is sleeping on the couch and Chris just contemplates his next move. That night, Chris is watching a movie at work and is stressed on the thought of money. He jumps on the phone and makes a call to Eddie to say he's in. Both Mike and Jimmy are ready to go, but the two of them debate on whether to tell Spiro or not. However, Jimmy buckles under the pressure and says he's out. After he leaves, Mike assures the other two that Jimmy won't say a word to Spiro or he's a dead man. With that, Chris immediately gets down to the detail. On Thursday night, he'll be the only man there. Eddie will need to jump a fence and break a camera. The next night, on Friday night, the guards will be out by 8. Once they leave, he'll call them on a payphone. But as the plan plays out in real time, Detective James barges in and says there's word of a crew coming in tonight. He gets his men to secure the place. The other two wait for the phone call and Chris stresses out. The cops determine that everything is quiet and that the only problem is how pathetic the cameras and security system is. When the cop has his back turned, Chris notifies Eddie as James walks back in. Chris tells him that it was his mother on the phone, but when James is about to call back, he is alerted to a situation outside. Seems someone just jumped the fence, and as James opens the door, a shootout immediately takes place and everyone takes cover. Backup is requested and the cops use their man on the roof to try and take out their intruders. Chris in the meantime makes his way outside with his gun. James slowly makes his way to the man hiding behind the truck. When the time is right, the cop on the roof shoots and kills one perp while James finds and puts multiple bullets in the second. But it seems it was not Mike, and as the person is about to get up, Chris kills him. Later, Mike knows that someone snitched on their operation, and he shoots Jimmy dead on the street and tells Eddie he still wants to do the robbery. The next day, Chris comes outside to his name in the paper. He immediately goes to Eddie and learns that Mike killed Jimmy and that he still wants to do the robbery. Chris loses it and says it's over, but Eddie tells him it's happening with or without him. That night, the guards clock out at 8. Chris watches the cameras and he hears a bang sound upstairs. Out of nowhere, Eddie drops in through the roof and says he's not leaving without the money. The phone rings and Chris answers to the boss, who says there was a disturbance. He plays it off and Eddie tells him to open the gate. He listens, and as it opens, Eddie immediately wants access to the money. Chris puts in the pin and tells him to put his mask on, but when a dog approaches, Eddie kills it. Chris yells at him and Eddie runs and knocks Chris out. He soon awakens to the cops all over the crime scene. Detective James is the first to approach him, and when Chris states he cannot believe this happened to him 3 times in a month. The other detectives all surround Chris and both question and pressure him. They grill him non-stop, but he just says his head is messed up and they leave him be. Once he arrives home, there are cops and news reporters waiting for him. They tell him $9 million went missing and he ignores them and goes inside. He heads straight to his phone and calls Eddie. But when he doesn't pick up, Chris goes to search for him. When his father pulls him up and asks what's going on, Chris lies and simply states that he's going for a walk, but Tommy doesn't believe it and mentions that if Eddie is involved, he's going to kill him. The FBI in the meantime meet up with District Attorney Rudolph and tell him upwards of $10 million was stolen. One of the agents believed the previous robbery was just a decoy, but they all believe that Chris was too dumb to pull this off and he was not involved. Their boss tells them this was organized crime and to go after the 5 big families. With that, the organized crime families are immediately arrested and are all taken in for questioning. Chris then links up with Eddie and whacks him. Both of them are quite tense and Mike wants a meeting with the both of them, but Chris refuses and tells Eddie that he'll kill him if he ever sees him again. Seems Chris has $8 million to himself now, and Detective James sees the whole thing playing out. Eddie then goes directly to Mike's car, and as he done the robbery on his own without telling Mike, Mike is quite upset and now wants Eddie to pay for a Colombian deal that's worth $8 million. Eddie agrees on the condition Chris is not involved. James also watches this take place and immediately heads back to the station to discover Mike's identity. At night, Mike links up with his boss Spiro, who asks him where Jimmy's been lately. He makes up an excuse and goes to use the bathroom. James and his partner then walk in and speak to Spiro. They ask if anyone has any info on the heist and Spiro makes fun of the question and brushes it off. James immediately points out Mike and asks if he had any involvement. Spiro answers on his behalf and mentions that his men wouldn't go behind his back or something might happen to them. James then leaves and Mike is told to sit down. James heads back to the station and watches the camera where Eddie spoke to Chris. Just then, Chris walks into the station and James ushers him into his office. He thanks him for saving his life the previous night and then gets to questioning him. He hands him a paper of both Mike and Eddie and asks if he has any association with them. He says he knows them but hasn't spoken in a while. James then shows him the tape of Eddie speaking to someone before breaking the camera. Chris says he didn't see anyone else, and with that he gets up to leave. James warns him that if he's involved he's going to drag him right to jail. That night, Mike and Eddie make their way to the Colombians. Chris gets home but a car pulls up and a man says Spiro wants to talk. Mike and Eddie then arrive at the Colombian house. They both sit down and Eddie looks out of place. He's very jumpy and Mike opens the bag on the table to reveal $8 million. The Colombian then asks where Jimmy is, and Mike tells them he's out of the game. With that, the men take the bag to count the money. Chris in the meantime links up with Spiro and his boys. Spiro asks his men where their special guest is and he is told inside the bathroom. Spiro immediately questions Chris and wants the money from the robbery. Out of nowhere, Jimmy comes out of the bathroom and somehow managed to survive the bullet. Spiro tells Chris he wants the money and wants it now. James and his partner in the meantime decide to pay Nancy a visit. They ask her if it's okay to look in Eddie's locker. The manager comes down and agrees to take them. Once in the back, James opens up the locker to see a paper of the planned robbery. The Colombians meanwhile say the cash is right and there was $400 extra. He then tells Eddie and Mike to leave. He doesn't want to give them the supply and wants them to get out right now. Mike doesn't want to, and he is shot in the mouth. He immediately retaliates and Eddie makes a run for it while Mike is killed. Chris in the meantime is dropped off on the side of the road. Eddie rushes to a payphone to call him, but James appears from behind and tells Eddie it's over. At the station, James says the crime families are locked up and wants to know how a mid-level Colombian dealer ended up with half the money. James wants the other half and plans on letting Eddie go but wants to know where Chris and the money is. Chris meanwhile heads home to more officers looking for him. Nancy asks him what's going on and he tells her to check the statue for the money. Tommy notices this and Eddie in the meantime finds Chris and runs to him. He alerts him that the cops know everything and Chris alerts Eddie to Jimmy still being alive. With the $16 million that they stole and only half remaining with Chris, Eddie pulls out a gun and wants more cash. Out of nowhere, Tommy pops up and shoots Eddie. He isn't messing around and holds Eddie at gunpoint as cops approach. Once they arrive, James and the rest of the force tell Tommy to put the gun down. All three men there are arrested and Chris is forced to watch his own dad be arrested from his mistakes. As this is a true story, the FBI announces to the public that Chris Potomaitis was the mastermind of the robbery. This is Chris in real life as of 2013, and the owner of the property was bewildered how the burglars got through the roof. The rest of the money was never found and the real Chris says it just disappeared. Chris and Eddie were released in 1991 and that's the end. Make sure to like and subscribe and I'll see you on the next one.